Good evening and welcome everyone. This is an open meeting of the Needham Finance Committee. I'm Joshua Levy, Committee Chair. It's Wednesday, January 12th, 2022, and the meeting is being conducted remotely, consistent with current state regulations, and is being recorded. Public access to this meeting does not ensure that there will be public participation unless the law requires it. This meeting will not have public comment except in connection with the first item of business, citizen requests to address the Finance Committee. First, I will confirm that a quorum of the members of the Finance Committee are present. When I call your name, please acknowledge your presence. John Connolly.
Here.
Barry Kaufman.
Here.
Rick Lunetta.
Here.
Dick Riley.
Here.
And the chair is here. I anticipate that other members will join at a later time, and we'll have them identify themselves at that point. As a reminder, anything you share or state will be a matter of public record. As a preliminary matter, I would ask for a motion to continue the meeting to January 19th, 2022 in the event of a technical disruption this evening.
So moved.
Second.
We'll take a roll call. Rick?
Yes.
Dick?
Yes.
Barry?
Yes.
John?
Yes.
And the chair votes yes. So we'll move on to the first item on the agenda, citizen request to address the Finance Committee. If there are any residents who wish to address the Finance Committee, please use the raise hand feature through Zoom. If you are on a telephone, you can also press *9. I'm looking at the attendee list and I don't see anyone at the moment.
I don't see anyone.
No. Okay, so we'll move on to the next item, approval of minutes of the prior meeting from January 5th, 2022. Did anyone have any comments about those minutes?
I move their approval. Second.
Okay. We'll take a roll call. Rick?
Yes.
Dick?
Yes.
Barry?
Yes.
John?
Yes.
And the chair votes yes. Okay, so the next item is department budget hearings, town clerk, board of registrars. Dave, if you could bring in the town clerk. And once she's in, I think Barry has an introduction.
Town clerk's with us.
Welcome, Teddy.
Thank you.
Hey, Teddy, how are you?
I thought maybe you didn't want me to come after all.
No.
You're always welcome.
I met with Teddy last week to go through her budget. It's a level funded budget. I will say it's been a tumultuous few years with all the elections, and I commend Teddy and her staff. I think we all appreciate and have experienced their efficiency and getting everything done that was thrust upon them, all the changes that they've been forced to undertake over the last few years. So the only differences in the budget year to year tends to be based on the number of elections. So odd years, there's generally one election, and even years, there are 3. Including a primary, 2 elections and a primary. So the fiscal 22 that we're in now had 1 election. Fiscal 23 has scheduled 3, 2 elections and a primary. So that's the principal difference in the budget. Couple of other notable items. The current budget year that we're in did have an extra election that wasn't planned for. So I think we'll be anticipating, and Teddy can talk more about the details, a transfer request for the special election for the select to replace the select board member. And that will be in the range of probably $20,000 or so, plus or minus a few thousand. I will not make any comments about that, just stating the fact. And the other changes, I think Teddy their department became the chief records office for all public record requests, which just add another administrative item to their already busy lives. But again, all this is done with the same level of staffing that she's had for the last few years. And I think that is to be noticed and acknowledged. And with that, The only other thing I probably should mention, and Teddy could talk a little bit about, the revenues are down, will be down in fiscal 22. They were down in fiscal 21 and will be down again in fiscal 22 as a result of the alcohol license fees being transferred to the town manager's department. Fees aren't themselves, I don't think, are down, but just the switching, recording them in a different department, it just gets reflected in the respective budgets. And with that, I'll let Teddy elaborate on some of the things I highlighted and anything else that she wants to talk about in her budget.
Well, the latest thing you said was the fact that we're level staffed. I did get a part-time person approved through HR, and I was hoping to put a DSR4 in, but it's been busy, so I've let it go because I'm hoping to hire a part-time person, which is under 20 hours a week, and see how that goes. And if it works well and we're managing, then maybe we'll leave it at the current staff level, which is 4 full-time and 1 part-time. In all fairness, I have to say we have a couple of old timers that may come in 12 hours a week. They'll do some of the catch-up stuff that we don't seem to get the time to do. And they love to come in and they do a good job. So you've probably heard me ranting and raving the last few days because we have our election workers in, we're stuffing the census, and we hope to get that out next week, which is actually 3 weeks late. I've always tried to get the census out in the beginning of January or the end of December, but this year we have all town meeting members running for re-election because of the federal census redistricting, which the state has not finalized yet. We have been told that we will get this finalized sometime in January. So I've sent out the town meeting member written acceptance. They're coming in, and we've got about 60 in of the 240 so far. And we have new candidates taking out papers. And it's just, it's just a busy office no matter what the dog licenses are due now, and the programmer has a glitch. So some lady called me and said her credit card was charged $2,066 for a $20 dog. It's like, it's not our fault, honest it isn't. But he's resolved that, and he keeps saying he's going to resolve everything. So we're hoping this becomes a little calmer in the next few weeks. What else can I tell you? You said it all, Barry.
Sorry,
I don't know what else to say.
I just highlighted the.
I am still, okay, excuse me. I am still waiting on a couple more bills to come in for this special election we had. I had originally thought it would be closer to 30,000, but I'm thinking it's going to be closer to 20,000. I did not use early voting, which would have cost us more money. They could early vote by mail, but I didn't hire people to come in and have a week of early voting Monday through Friday, which you have to do under normal circumstances. Those deadlines for the early voting ended December 15th. So right now we don't know what the state's going to do or the legislature is going to do as far as changing some of the election laws. That's really up in the air. But a couple more bills, and I will send Dave the notice, and he can go submit it to the Finance Committee with hopes that you'll approve it.
So dog licenses exceeded alcohol licenses in 2021. That was due to COVID?
No, no. The alcohol revenue is now no longer going to be part of the department.
Oh, okay.
No, that was a surprise to me, I will admit, because since before I was elected, the town clerk's office has always collected the money for the alcohol licenses. But the select board now has their own permitting program, which I guess the town clerk's office is going to get involved in at a later date as they include other departments. But it's okay. They do most of the works and they want to collect the money, and I can understand that. Dogs, we have about 3,600 dogs in the town of Needham. That's quite a few. So, it takes us 6 months to license all these dogs.
Wow.
And those that don't license then get a $50 fine, and then they yell at us for the next 3 months. Dave will have to tell you a story sometime about one irate dog owner who received the fine. I won't tell tales.
I'll have to ask about that. Yeah, so I would just note that Carol and Louise are here. Does anyone else have any questions for Teddy? Okay. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thanks, Teddy.
That was fast.
That was it? No more questions? Okay, I'm going to another Zoom meeting then.
Oh, Dick, did you have something?
Nice to see you all.
No, I was waving goodbye. Bye-bye.
Okay, I'll
Good to see
wave
you.
too.
Tell the garden club hello.
Now. Yes, it is the garden club. I won't tell you what tomorrow night is.
I can guess, I bet.
Enjoy.
All right. Thank you.
Take care,
Bye-bye.
Teddy.
So Dave, the next is the school department. Would you bring the superintendent, assistant superintendent for finance and operations? I see several school committee members as well. I assume that they would like to be brought over, but I'll let the superintendent say who else he'd like to bring in as well. In the meantime, while that's happening, I'll just briefly summarize. John, Carol, and I, as liaisons to the school department, met to discuss the budget 3 times on December 8th, 21st, and January 4th. There were several questions, and we really do appreciate the quick responses that we received. I imagine there'll probably be some more questions tonight, but here's just a quick top-line summary. The FY23 budget request is in the amount of $87.2 million, which represents a $3.6 million increase, or 4.3% over the current fiscal year 2022 budget. And so I'll hand it over to Dr. Gutekunst for a more detailed summary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. The central office team is also listening, and I think maybe we can wait until I do a brief presentation, but if first, I believe Chair Connie Barr wanted to make some comments before I do a brief presentation.
Certainly. Welcome, Connie.
Good to be here, and thank you. Basically what I want to do is say thank you to all of you on the behalf of the school committee for, we hear sometimes about how things go in other towns, and we count ourselves very lucky to work with your group who are, we manage a lot in the school department. You manage finances and issues for the entire town. And during this time of COVID, this has been extraordinarily taxing. But with your help, we've been able to keep our children in school for the most part. And that is pretty impressive. So we just, again, I want to express as a town meeting member, as a resident of Needham, and as chair of the school committee on behalf of the school committee, how much we appreciate your consistently hard work and the time you put in to make sure we can move things forward. And we hope that once again, Dr. Gutekunst really leads us, he and Ann, in being as thoughtful as possible with the funds that we're requesting. And it really has been also great to work with our FinCom liaisons. The questions are great, and to be able to focus on being able to present to you exactly why we're doing what is really helpful. So it's not empty words by any means. Thank you to all of you. And I think Dan will take over.
Thanks, Connie. If it's okay to have the ability to share the screen, I'd like to share a brief presentation.
You should be able to.
Thank you, Dave. Well, thanks, members of the Finance Committee. I appreciate being here tonight. I want to go through several slides. I'll go through fairly briefly, and we'll shoot these off to Louise for her to distribute. What you're going to see tonight really is a reflection of what we've shared with our liaisons and what is in the budget that you've already received. So let me just go ahead and get right into it. As Connie was alluding to, and I know you are aware of this from talking to other department heads, it's been a challenging time. We were hoping health and safety would not dominate as much as it has been, but it is continuing to be a key part of our planning, and I imagine that will happen as we go into next year as well. In particular, increased needs of students who have been impacted by COVID, whether they're special education students who lost services, or the mental health needs that are increasing throughout the community. These are things that we will be dealing with for a while. We're also dealing with enrollment that's down by about 180 students. You'll see, though, that even though our enrollment's down, the needs have been exacerbated, and so there is a request for more resources to deal with these needs. You will also hear from me, and I'm happy to participate at any time, that there continue to be maintenance needs in our buildings that require significant and ongoing attention from the town. And in particular, these have a lot to do with heating and ventilation, which has been highlighted recently as one of the key things that we all need to keep our buildings, whether they're schools, firehouses, or our own homes, healthy. But this is an area that I'm hoping that I can work with the town on to support. Of course, our work is focused on making sure that we prioritize the Portrait of a Needham Graduate strategic priorities, making sure that we're emphasizing equity and our anti-racist efforts, which are essential to all of our kids' lives. We're proud of that work. This budget supports that work, and we're looking forward to continuing to implement many of those things. What I think you should know that at a very high level, what we can do with the funds, if this budget is appropriated by town meeting, is to make sure that we continue to have our classroom staffed by an increasingly diverse and talented faculty with class sizes ranging and student-to-teacher ratio of 1 to 18 to 20 students. It will also provide targeted support for students who have been impacted by the pandemic or who just certainly have needs, English language learners. And also in particular, we're targeting resources for math and literacy at particular schools where we feel the need is greatest. It's also going to make sure that our students have access to co-curricular activities that are inclusive, that emphasize parity, and do not require the payment of additional fees to participate. We also believe that this budget is going to make sure that we have the tools that we need to continue to provide for our students. Our priorities voted by the school committee, first of all, include making sure that the Portrait of Needham Graduate strategic priorities are implemented, make sure that we have targeted interventions at the elementary and middle level, particularly during this time of the pandemic, make sure we continue to refine our curriculum and instruction and assessment programs, and make sure we have the educational and human resources that support student learning. The budget that Josh referred to has ticked up slightly, about $77,000. I'll explain why as I go through this presentation. Originally, what I proposed to the school committee is contractual salary increases of $1.8 million, and that remains essentially the same. Level service of $612,000, and then program improvements just shy of $1.2 million. However, since we have begun discussions with the school committee, and since we've received additional information around counseling needs, significant counseling needs at the high school, I'm including in this request for your consideration, and the school committee will review this again next week, a request for an additional counselor at Needham High School. So that ups the total request to $3,674,401. This also includes, and I want to point this out, we did scrub our budget, our existing budget, to see where we might be able to make reductions in services, substitutes, and supplies. And so we've been able to identify thus far, and there may be others, at least $92,000 that we can pull out from our existing resources so they can be redeployed. We continue to do this, by the way, to make sure that we're being as prudent as we possibly can with the dollars. I mentioned that we continue to have needs, and so this budget request is a large one. We're requesting just under 26 FTEs. Now, I will point out that many of these positions, actually many more, are working now in our schools because of the pandemic. These are teachers for class size reduction. These were teacher assistants, support staff, interventionists. I'm not recommending all of those moving forward, but I am recommending primarily teaching positions to help make sure that we're addressing needs where enrollment has creeped up, for example, at Elliott, and where we need mental health and special education supports. So all told, this budget includes these 25.82 full-time equivalent positions. The overall effect is a 4.4% increase over FY22. As I said, a $3.6 million increase. Most of it reflects negotiated contracts. We are, by the way, in the third year of a contract with our Unit A teachers and Unit B administrators, and we will be negotiating a new contract for the new fiscal year and the subsequent 2 years after that. So we already have baked into our contract our plans as we move forward. And then level service and program improvements for $1.2 million. Program improvements much larger than other years. That's because we've decided that we've taken some of the positions that we inserted this year due to COVID, and I've been talking about them as improvements, but in many ways they really are quite necessary. So I would say that the gold and the red in some cases really merge. But we certainly can talk about that as we discuss the budget. Enrollment is always a context in our budget. We did, as I mentioned earlier, we lost about 180 students from October 2019. And we expect, because of our enrollment, and as you know, we've gone through an enrollment analysis already, we expect that enrollment will essentially stay level for the foreseeable future. It's not going to increase significantly, a slight uptick, nor is it going to decrease for the next 15 years, but essentially remain level. We did survey the families who did leave the Needham Public Schools as a result, well, we assume as a result of the pandemic, and we don't expect, after we contacted all of them, that most of them will be returning. So we don't necessarily see these 180 students coming back. Some of that could change, but we've already done that work to determine where we're at. So we see enrollment generally as a steady for us for the foreseeable future. We continue to make sure that we use our dollars prudently. We have a 1 to 13 student-teacher ratio. It is among the highest, despite the resources we put at it. Now, part of this, by the way, is because some communities continue to lose students. Wellesley is a good example, but they're not necessarily laying off teachers. And so when you lose students but keep the same staffing levels, your student-teacher ratio is going to go down. We have not been, except for the 180 students, by the way, they were spread K through 12 throughout the system. We've also had to increase staff. Our student level remained essentially level. So we remain kind of stuck in this position of still having a higher student-teacher ratio, and yet something we work on, and we recognize that it's a work in progress, and we're pleased to have the resources that we do to meet our students' needs.
And Dan, just to clarify on that, I think we've had this, I've asked this before, but to remind me, this isn't classroom size necessarily. This is including all teachers, special teachers, correct?
That's correct. Josh points that out. We aspire in this budget to have approximately one teacher to every 18 to 20 students. Those are classroom teachers. This ratio here comes from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, and it includes special educators, art teachers, instructional coaches, nurses, guidance counselors. It includes anybody who is in essentially Unit A, which is the bulk of our staff.
Thank you.
Special education trends. As you can see, our enrollment in special education has remained just generally flat over the last few years, and the state has ticked up just a bit, but we want you to know where that's at. And what this represents is that 17.5% of all students are identified as special education students in Needham. We do have a percentage of our students who are educated outside the district, as you know, in special education programs. These are students for whom we cannot provide inside our schools. They may have significant learning needs, significant medical needs, or social and behavioral needs that we are unable to fulfill within the Needham Public Schools. And so we send them out of district to a special education school. And of the percentage of all of our special education students, you can see that this figure has generally remained flat over time, and right now is about 7.6% of all of our students. One of the things yes.
Excuse me. How would you say the percentage of our special education students as a percent of total compares with our universe of schools as opposed to the statewide number? Would it be any different or similar?
I would say it's generally similar. I don't think that if you look around the neighborhood, as I like to say, it's going to really change much, but it's probably similar. There are swings, of course, in communities as you go a little further west or you go a little further east of us. But I'd say in the neighborhood, this is about the range you would find.
Okay, thanks.
By the way, one of the things that's missing in this budget request, I shouldn't say missing, is not included, is a request for additional special education funding. That's for a variety of reasons. We have students who are aging out of district placements. When they age 22, they leave, and so we no longer have to pay their tuition. We, as you know, the Finance Committee has been very supportive of the school committee efforts to have in-district programs, which have been highly successful. So we've been able to keep more students where they belong, frankly, if we can educate them in our schools, and that's been helpful. And then lastly, we've received more circuit breaker funding from the state than anticipated. So all told, we are not looking for additional tuition dollars for next year. Now, let me talk to you a little about these targeted interventions, which are really very key to continuing to meet needs of students, particularly as we deal with this health emergency. We're looking for a couple of teachers, particularly at Elliott, to make sure class sizes are reasonable. We are looking for some specialists to accompany them. For example, if you add a class section at Elliott in 3rd grade, you also have to add a portion of an art teacher, a music teacher, a PE teacher. All told throughout the district, we're looking for just under 4.3 FTEs to support class size and the accompanying specialists. In special education, we are looking for 5.5 FTE teachers to provide support throughout the district. Heavily, much of it focused at the high school. English language learner, we want to increase a high school position by 0.2. Counseling, now when the Finance Committee saw this slide before, it was 1.4 FTEs, a counselor at Pollard and part of a counselor at the elementary level. This now includes an additional counselor at the high school. And I think the key thing there is that it's become apparent to me as our budget, we requested our budget development from our department heads in September. And as the fall and winter have gone on and as it becomes increasingly clear that families cannot access service, Needham Youth Services is working overtime and been using local dollars and federal dollars to support mental health services. But we find the same thing going on in our schools. And so we want to continue a position that we started this year because we felt a huge need, and that need we believe is going to continue. We also look to increase nursing at the high school and at Pollard. Math literacy intervention is hugely important. We right now have additional math and literacy intervention at all of our schools because of COVID. But next year we're targeting it. We're not suggesting let's just keep everything that we have going. We're targeting it primarily at Newman and Elliott and High Rock and Pollard. You know, we'll see in subsequent years if other schools need support, but for now, that's really where the support is needed. And then finally, we're looking at general education teacher assistants at the elementary level, one for each elementary school, all of whom certainly in recent times have been kept very busy, substituting, helping manage the office, and just really keeping things going. And these assistants will continue to work with our principals and teachers to support student learning.
And Dan, could I ask for clarification? Are all of those positions currently funded through temporary grants?
I may lean on Ann, but most of these positions are funded through grants, or we held back, for example, on supplies and services from teachers and rather from schools so that we could fund positions. There are many more than this, but these are the approximately 21 that we would like to move forward into next year.
Hey Dan, can I ask a quick question about the positions related to class size? And I realize it's not you just can't take total numbers and in given with the demographics amongst the grades. But could you just, for the last 2 years, obviously we've seen a reduction in students and it's not going up this year. So why any additional teachers related to class size?
Yeah, it's a fair question, Barry. And I guess the way I would respond to it is that the 180 students that we no longer have were sprinkled throughout the system, K through 12. And if they were targeted at a grade level or a school, that would be one way to address, maybe move some staff around. But that really hasn't been the case. And Elliott and Sunita Williams in particular, their enrollment has been growing. And so, whereas maybe 2 years ago, October of 2019 at Broadmeadow, for example, you might have had a third grade class with 23 students in it. Now that same third grade class, I'm using this to make share an example. That same class 2 years later might have 21 students in it. So let's say those 2 students, they didn't return. Now, obviously, they're not in the third grade anymore, but I'm just trying to illustrate the conundrum we face. So we can't collapse a class at Broadmeadow because it lost 2 students. We still have to have that class. At the same time, at Elliott and Sunita Williams, enrollment is growing. And in fact, next year at Elliott, we will no longer have an art room, a music room, or the performance center or a technology room as we've had in the past. We will be using those rooms for classrooms. And that's the first time, we're doing most of that this year actually because of growing enrollment at Elliott, but next year really we're finalizing that. And it will be the first time that school will really be over capacity because of its growing enrollment in that part of the community. So that it sounds a bit counterintuitive. You're losing 180 students, but you're asking for more teachers. It's just that there are more students actually enrolling in those 2 schools, and we need to keep up with that. But they're just not enough that we can pull out of the other schools because there's still students waiting in seats.
Dick, did you have a question?
Yeah, I actually have 2 questions. One, you used the phrase, Dan, specifically with respect to the math and literacy intervention of targeting school. What do you mean by that?
So on this slide here, you'll see that this is what we're looking at specifically for the elementary level. And I can ask Terry Duggan to share more about that as well. But just the brief response is, one of the things that we really have been focused on is making sure our students are their math, their literacy, and their social emotional learning, their mental health supports are really strong last year and into this year, because we know that there is a need to really support students in new and different ways because of their interrupted learning. And so this year, we brought on board a 0.5 or half of a math interventionist, for example, a math coach who's working both directly with students or working with teachers, a 0.5 in each elementary school. Now, that was a bit uneven because Newman is bigger than Elliott, but we figured it was a way that, we could get these supports in schools. It was just, frankly, easy math, if you will. However, for next year, we're not just suggesting, well, let's just bring those folks back. Instead, we looked at the data. We've, Terry has and her team have shared a lot of recent data with the school committee. And we've realized that Newman and Elliott require some additional math support. Newman and Elliott require some additional math support, and Mitchell and Elliott require some additional literacy support that is required because, in particular, Elliott is a Title I school. And I won't go into all the rules around Title I, but there's some restrictions there. In any event, the point is we're trying to target interventions, including counseling and including nursing, where we really feel it is needed now, but also in the foreseeable future. The Summer Bridges program, by the way, is a new program. We've instituted it. This was our second year. We started it for all Needham students. We're identifying as many students as we can to come in the summer. We pair up with Parks and Rec, and we provide academic support in the morning, this is for several weeks, and then they participate in a Parks and Rec program. Now, we've been able to fund this through federal COVID dollars over the last couple of years. The program has been so successful with about 130, 140 students participating. We felt it was important enough to have everybody continue to let this program grow and expand to provide support for all Needham students. We don't want to charge tuition for it. We want students to be able to, who need extra support over the summer, come in, learn from the teachers who care for them, and then participate in a Park and Rec program. Now, the program fully implemented is about $75,000. I'm only requesting in the budget $37,000 because we are very fortunate this year to have some partners in the community who would like to support the other half of the program. I'll know more about that later, and I'll be sharing that with the school committee. But we have community partners, as you well know, who are organized and really want to try to provide targeted support for students. So instead of me saying, well, we'll just put it all in the budget, we're putting part of it in the budget. We'll see where it goes in the future. And I'm excited to offer that for our students, particularly at this time.
I did have another question. I'm not sure whether this is the time for it or later, but it deals with staffing. And that is, a lot of people are in various businesses, it's a general proposition of having difficulty staffing levels, and have, you know, this whole question of people, the great resignations and so forth. How is that factored into your numbers?
So I'll tell you what, Mr. Riley, how about if I do this? How about if I zip through the rest of these slides?
Okay, that's what I said. I'm not sure when the right point to ask the question is.
No, it's a great question, by the way, and actually it's something we're quite concerned about. But if I zip through the rest of these slides, okay, we can all look at each other.
Dan, before you do, could you just quickly, I'm just curious, the funding for this summer program, is that from individuals or organizations or businesses?
We are working with one or two community partners who have expressed some interest in supporting that, the other half of that. So it's not individuals.
Okay.
Dick, I'm not going to forget your question, and you're going to remind me if I do. You know, how are we filling these positions? At the middle school level, again, targeted interventions and support for math and literacy, counseling, some stipends that we want to include to continue our work around equity and inclusion. At the high school level, we're looking for some elective teachers in English and social studies, special education teachers, the counselor that I had mentioned, our nursing, part of a nurse English language learner program, some additional stipends. And also, we're looking to develop some parity in our athletic program. For example, we through the kindness of the Needham Golf Course and the Needham Golf Charities, we've been able to start a girls golf program that's been funded by outside sources, but we now like to wrap it in the budget because we have a boys golf program and we have sufficient interest. In the same way, we have rugby, and that would also like to have a program because we have a boys program. So this is a matter of parity. We also have a program, the Seal of Biliteracy, which is a program where a student who speaks a second language can receive on her or his diploma a seal from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts that they are fluent in at least 2 languages. And it's an honor. They may have studied that in the Needham Public Schools. They may have come with that language from their family background or from being an immigrant. But we're really proud to offer this program, and it really speaks to our values of encouraging students to be able to embrace other cultures and obviously speak another language. We've charged a fee for that in the past. We're proposing that we no longer charge a fee for this program, that if a student, because it has prevented some students from participating, and if there can be no barrier to something like this, we think it would be great, and it will allow our students to participate in the program because there are many who are interested. I also included in the budget is a subsidy to avoid another fee increase this year. As you know, we charge significant fees already. And I think if we can subsidize the athletic budget by a small amount, we can avoid a fee increase that will just end up going back on the backs of families who are already contributing significantly. We also are looking for a position to coordinate our amazing fine and performing arts program, and that is to help coordinate the 3 auditoriums we perform at, all of the different community groups that want to use our auditoriums, and to work with our teachers and staff. We just don't have that pulled together, and it's time that that happen. We're looking for someone to, as part of program improvements, to coach our K-12 world language teachers. Right now, and I'm not sure how it works in your professional lives or in corporate world, but we have an amazing world language director and a fine and performing arts director, both of whom supervise and are responsible for about 33 folks each, for whom they are essentially direct reports. What we're looking at is perhaps in world languages to provide some additional support for our world language director is to hire someone at 0.4. Now, this could be someone who's already here part-time, and this would be an additional increase in their day, to help provide coaching to our newer teachers, which would alleviate some pressure on our world language director, and quite frankly, really provide some coaching and modeling for our teachers that is sorely needed. Additionally, we're looking at some curriculum and professional development funds. We propose in there a rollout of supporting technology replacement over the next few years. We're not asking for all of it at the same time, but over a few years. And then again, there are some funds in there to make sure that we can retain and recruit bus drivers. That is a position, this is to Dick Riley's question, that is sorely needed. Our transportation director, Shane, has been driving a van all year because we are short a van driver. That impacts his ability to communicate with families, to continue routing, and to problem solve and train drivers, but it's where we're at. So we have included some funds to make sure that we can hold on to our pretty amazing drivers. My last slide is this, and looking ahead to FY24, because one of the things we're trying to do is to think about the budget in 2 or 3 year pieces, if you will, even though we know it's not appropriated that way. We do think that over the next couple of years that we will need some additional teachers in special areas. They could come from other areas of the budget, but they might also be requests for new funds to strengthen some of our interdisciplinary options. We have some great interdisciplinary programs. You've heard about the Greater Boston Project, for example, and there are others that we intend to strengthen. We want to make sure that we can provide even more professional development and learning for our staff. That requires some resources. I'm hoping we can have a community conversation about our fees and really think about how much do we really want to charge for transportation and athletics. I think just as we had a conversation about full-day kindergarten, it'd be great if we could have a conversation about either avoiding or maybe even eliminating fees for transportation and athletics. That's a big conversation. That's an aspirational conversation, but I think it's something that school committee is certainly ready to begin thinking about. We also want to strengthen in-district programs. We're pleased with what we've done, but there are still needs that we need to make sure happen. We're very much focused on recruiting and supporting our talented and diverse staff. We've been very fortunate to hire some amazing people, and we've increased the diversity of our staff, which we think is hugely important for a whole lot of reasons that we've had a national discussion about and a local discussion about. But to me, the most important discussion is for a young person, perhaps a young Black student or an Hispanic student, to walk into a classroom and see a teacher who looks like her or him. That has an amazing impact, not only on that individual student, but all the other students in the class who know that they can learn, work, and grow together in a diverse school classroom environment, because indeed, that's what the world is. And then, of course, we'll continue to make sure through our contract negotiations that we're competitive with our other communities, and that we make sure that we're supporting our staff, who have been amazing over the last couple of years. Well, they've been amazing since I've been here, but our staff has stepped it up in significant ways, and I know the town staff has as well. And so I'm hoping through our negotiations, we can use available resources, which is very important because there are not unlimited resources, and make sure that we are supporting them with competitive salaries. Mr. Chair, I am finished with my presentation. And
thank you, Dr. Grigg-Hentz. That was a great summary. And just to echo some of Connie's comments earlier, I mean, I think the reason why we spend so much time on this particular department budget is because schools is such a huge part of this town. And so it deserves our time and attention. So I guess at this point, I'll open it up for questions. Keeping in mind, I know Dick already asked one. Go ahead, Louise.
Okay, is it okay to go ahead and go to Dick's question?
Yeah.
Because I'll forget it, and then that'll be then he'll be mad at me and all that.
You bet I will.
We've the short story is we've had a really difficult time hiring for positions, and I don't know how much better that will get in the fall. We're fortunate that you know, particularly recently in the last week or two, we've had good attendance and increasing attendance from our staff. Our staff attendance has been about 90% on average over the last 7 days because of illnesses and COVID. Today it was at its highest ever, about 93%. Still, that's much lower than our attendance usually is for our staff. Our student attendance has remained steady at about 85, 86%. That's much lower than it usually is. But it speaks to the broader issue of being able to bring people on board. We recently shared with the Finance Committee that right now, as of about today, there are approximately 30 positions that we have not filled in the Needham Public Schools. Some of these are recent vacancies. Some of these are vacancies that have languished since the beginning of the year. Teacher assistants, van driver I mentioned. We've been pretty successful at filling our teacher positions. There is a market, there is a cadre of really talented and diverse teachers out there that Alex Montes McNeil, our Human Resources Assistant Superintendent, is aggressive in filling. And so we are able to meet that need. And yet we're concerned. We're concerned for the future because fewer students are going into education. And there is still some fear, I think, on the part of folks who used to work in schools that the pandemic has kept them out of school. So I'm hoping we'll turn a corner and that we'll be able to hire the folks that we need. But that continues to be a work in progress.
Thank you. Louise, go ahead.
So it seems to me in hearing what was presented, and I appreciate everything that was said in the presentation, that there are really two separate questions from a budgeting perspective. One of them is, what is it that you need for education in the Needham School District, regardless of whether we're in a pandemic or not? And the other question is, what do we need because of the pandemic? And we may or may not need that next year. We're responding to what we're seeing this year. What we saw last year was very different from what we're seeing this year. And I'm not sure that those should be items that are simply added to the budget. I think those should be identified and they may be temporary. And I'll just give you the one example because it was one of the most recent that was discussed, was additional support for the drivers. That is something that every community is experiencing. There just is a shortage of drivers right now. And I'm not sure that in the long term, that will be the case. And while we may think about providing additional support in the short term, I'm not sure that it makes sense for all of that to just be added to the budget, which then becomes the base budget for next year. I also am questioning that if certain positions are needed this year and are able to be funded this year, then can we understand what it is about the budget this year that allows for them to be funded this year? Thank you.
Sure, I'll have Angelotti maybe pick up on the funding of the positions for this year, but in response to the bus drivers and van drivers in particular, you're right, it may not be a forever thing, but it's an immediate need now and it will be into next year. The reality is those folks who are driving are aging. It's not a position that attracts younger people right now. And so it's something, my responsibility is to the Needham students, and I want to be able to make sure that Needham students can get to school. And I will do whatever we reasonably can now and into the near future to make sure that we have a salary that will attract them and keep our dedicated employees here. So I don't think it's a one-year thing. I think it's going to languish for quite a while. And in any event, if it doesn't, we have the ability to decide year from year to reallocate resources. I suggested earlier that we just in this budget deliberation, we reallocated about $100,000 in funds that we felt that we could redirect. So if it were no longer necessary to pay the bus drivers a retainer fee, for example, or a sign-on bonus, and those were in our budget, we could then redirect those fees, for example, to offset a bus subsidy or to help pay for a position. I would certainly recommend that. So I don't think that anything is forever. And yet I know that there are these needs here right now, and I think they will be here for a little while. Anne, can you comment on how generally we have funded these positions that we have today in the schools?
Louise, do you have a clarifying question?
Actually, before we go on to the second question, so the first one, I only use the bus drivers as an example. The first couple of slides had other positions. There are a number of positions that are being added that really are the reason for adding them was the increased needs of students at this point in time versus overall the increasing needs of the schools. And I think my point is exactly that. Once funds are in the school budget, you mentioned, well, then they could be redirected to maybe subsidizing transportation. That's the point. So at that point, we're not making the decision. We just happen to have additional funding and we will use them to subsidize something else. And this is not a judgment of whether it's the right thing or the wrong thing to do. I think all that I'm asking is, can we identify those that are really right now because of the pandemic, being caused by the pandemic, as opposed to those that are just part of the general curriculum and school education in Needham?
If I
I'll let, I see your impressment has his hands, and I know Ann can answer about the funding. Louise, it is a great question, and it's one we struggled with in the budget. I'll give you an example of what we didn't do. I had mentioned this, but we decided to hire math coaches to work with students and to work with staff, and we hired them for K through 6. In this budget, we decided, well, we don't necessarily need them every place. So let's look at the data. Let's look where the greatest need is, and let's then target those resources there. So that's what we have done with this budget. We've really tried to make sure that what we're bringing back is going to have an impact, not only next year, but beyond next year, because I don't think that need, particularly as I think about Newman Elliott, is going to be a one-time need. I think it's something that's going to go on. It's another reason why with the Summer Bridges program, I'm suggesting getting some funding for it, but not necessarily all of it right now, because I know they're interested community partners. Let's give it a third year to see what the interest is. Let's see if it really has the impact that we want it to. And then I may come to the Finance Committee next year and say, I'd like you to fund all of this. So we have tried to be thoughtful in that way. Anne, if you could share how we're funding these positions this year.
Louise, I guess I would just respond to your question by saying we actually provided an answer to that question in the list of questions that we sent to the committee. It's question number 2. The question was, which of the proposed staffing increases are COVID related, and which of these so-called COVID positions will recur into the future? And what we had identified were about 1.0 FTE nurses that are providing direct services that are perhaps COVID related. However, the impact of the pandemic on education has been a little more nuanced than direct service supports. For many kids, as you know, the pandemic presented a pretty significant disruption to the learning process that we are now providing supports to, we don't like to use the word remediate, but supports to help correct and to reverse some of those impacts in the future. That's not necessarily a one-year thing. That might the process of providing those learning supports is probably going to last for many years of the student's experience. In addition, the pandemic has resulted, it has exacerbated many mental health and behavioral needs that students have. It's unclear whether we're experiencing a one-year event or something that's going to occur for many years into the future. So the budget that you see before you includes many of the counseling and the licensed social worker and all of the positions that we've had to hire through our one-time resources going forward into the future. And it's very likely that those positions will be with us for some years and some time as we address these needs that are not likely to be one-time events. So the answer to question number 2, the attachment to that answer also provides the list of staffing that are funded from one-time sources this year and what those sources are. They include about $600,000 in grants, as well as circuit breaker revenue that we have carried forward for the 1 year that we are able to do so into this year. So those are the funding sources.
Thank you, Ann. Could I ask a clarifying question about that? So correct me if I misunderstood. There's about 1.0 in nurse FTEs that are directly supporting COVID-related issues. And then the remaining 20.28, I guess it sounds like they're indirect. So they're supporting COVID needs, or they are supporting needs as a result of COVID, but they're not supporting necessarily physical health like a nurse is. They could be supporting mental health. They could be supporting educational needs that are a result of changes in educational models or things that have occurred over the course of the pandemic that are needed. Are there any positions in the budget that are being requested that would have been included even if COVID hadn't happened?
Well, I'm sure that Mary Lammy and Dan would like to reply to this as well, but the pandemic probably hasn't caused many of the mental health and behavioral needs that students have, for example, but it has exacerbated them. So, the intensity of what we're seeing is probably somewhat COVID related, but the underlying needs have been potentially there and would be there even in the absence of the pandemic. So it's the intensity of the need that we're really addressing now, but the need for guidance counselors remains. Our staff have very high caseloads, for instance, in that area.
I would also, regarding special educators, which are, several of the positions, one of the things that we started a couple of years ago working with the school committee and the finance committee is to identify that we need to make sure we have reasonable caseloads of special educators. This was before the pandemic. And so we've worked toward making sure the caseloads and all that data has been provided. We discussed earlier in our liaison meetings. We've tried to keep our caseloads at a reasonable level, and there were a couple schools where they were out of balance. And so this budget reflects not only meeting these contemporary needs, but also addressing those caseloads in our elementary school and at the high school in particular. So it's hard to pull out the COVID from the non-COVID, and yet we have an eye toward what our strategic plan was to support special education students, for example, and also try to deal with these mental health needs as well.
Thanks. Louise, did you have a follow-up question?
So I did, because I guess, and this is not necessarily something we have to resolve today, but I do not understand why the circuit breaker reserve is one-time part, like it's a one-time charge. I understand that, but that is part of the budget, what we budget for the school department. And the circuit breaker reserve is, if I understand it correctly, surplus in the school department budget that then gets set aside as a circuit breaker reserve.
No, that's not quite correct. So when we develop our special needs tuition budget every year, and the FY23 budget is an example of this. The way we have to do that, as we're directed by DESE to do so, is that we estimate the amount of circuit breaker revenue we will receive in FY23, and then our total tuition obligation is reduced by that amount. So the amount that we request in the operating budget is the net. It's the remainder of money that we need after circuit breaker to finance special needs tuitions. The circuit breaker reserve that is listed on the sheet here is from last year. And we didn't spend, in anticipation of needing to address many of these needs, which we knew we would have beyond budget. The money that we received last year in FY21 from circuit breaker, we did not spend on special needs tuitions in FY21. And the state allows us to carry that forward for 1 year, and we've carried it forward into FY22. And it is in addition to the circuit breaker revenue we will receive this year, which we will spend on special needs tuitions. So it is essentially a one-time funding source that allows us to redirect operating budget resources to one-time needs. It won't continue into FY23.
And we will be receiving, we anticipate to receive circuit breaker funds for next year.
Correct.
Okay. Are there other questions related to this topic from the Finance Committee? Any other questions on different topics?
Yeah, I have a few on different topics. One actually may be a follow-on to the previous discussion. Could you elaborate some on the whole transportation budget? That has been a thorny issue in the past, and this, I'm not aware of what the impact of COVID and distancing has been on the bus patronage. But could you talk us through that, and what do we see coming down the road, so to speak?
Sure. You know, I may lean on Anne for that, but we just as a review of last year. So last year the rules were we had to space students apart on the buses. We had to have windows open, masking, every other seat. It was pretty complicated, and that's one of the reasons we had a program where half the students were in school at any one time, because that way we could get them to school. Every community in the Commonwealth was doing that, by the way. It wasn't unique to Needham. This year, all the students are back on the bus. And for the first time in, well, at least since I've been superintendent, we were able to find a seat for every child who wanted a seat the first day of school. And that's because Shane Marchand's pretty amazing. We did a lot of marketing around that. And there are some families who just didn't want to take the bus because they knew that it was going to be business as usual. So it was a combination of things. But Anne, as far as where we are with transportation, why don't you add to that?
Well, that's a very good summary of where we are to date. We still are not at the pre-pandemic ridership level that we had been, but our buses are filled. We, as Dan said, do not have a wait list this year, in part because our enrollment is still down a little bit. But the good news is that we've been able to provide a seat to all the students who want one. Students ride the bus with masks on, with the windows down for ventilation, and things have been going pretty well. The difficulty that we tend to have in transportation isn't so much around students and ridership this year as much as it is drivers. Our transportation company has been hard hit. We have our director every day filling in for a van driver position that we aren't able to fill. Luckily, we've been able to retain most of our drivers, absent one who had resigned. Unfortunately, you know, we're a really small operation. We don't have a huge bench of substitutes, if you will. We approach each day with optimism and a can-do attitude about how to get the kids to school. And our partners are pretty amazing, and they help us through each day.
In the past, the contracts have been a big issue with dramatic year-over-year increases, and sometimes. What's the status now?
Well, we're in a settled contract, so our contract increases are anticipatable. We'll be going out to bid again in a few years. So right now we're in a good place as far as that goes.
And if there aren't enough drivers, do we get credit against or are we stuck on that price regardless of whether they have the drivers or not?
Actually, where we have felt the lack of drivers the most is not so much in our daily yellow bus runs where we pick kids up from their homes and bring them to school. It's a lot more in the after school activities. On the occasions we may have to wait for quite a while for kids to get to athletic events. Sometimes we just don't have the drivers. But like I said, our partners are pretty amazing, and we've been trying to work through that. We did recently purchase a multifunction school activity bus, and a multifunction school activity bus is actually a large van that can be driven by you or I, someone who doesn't have a CDL or a special 7D van license. It can only be used for extracurricular transportation. It can't be used for transportation getting kids to school. But we are hoping that vehicle, which hasn't yet arrived, I think it's fallen victim to some of the supply chain issues that the rest of the world is experiencing. So when that vehicle does arrive, it's going to be something that some of our coaches are going to be able to drive. So it's going to be yet another way that we can try and meet some of these gaps when they do occur.
Thank you.
Mr. Riley, are you interested in driving a bus? Because you have a lot of interest in this, and we could absolutely help you out with this.
That's the.
I'll sign you up tonight.
Your insurance premiums would have to be significantly increased. I have a totally unrelated question.
Sure.
I think I read this correctly, that there was discussion in the ventilation area to the extent that the decision was made to work with a higher standard than was set by the National Association. I don't know what the association is. Could you talk us through that? How was that decision made? How was it arrived at? What are the economic implications of that decision? And as I don't recall us being involved at all in that decision, and I just don't have a sense of the incremental cost of, I think it was a standard of 4 or 6 versus some lower standard, and educate us, if you would, on that whole topic. Because last week, one of the main drivers, obviously, of the DPW expenses was the HVAC costs.
I will disappoint you if I'm going to try to educate you on the nuances of heating, ventilation, refrigeration. I'm not your guy. But what I can tell you is that once we learned more about COVID and we learned that it spread as a respiratory disease, one of the things that we knew was important, and it's obviously happening around the country and probably around the world, is that we needed to make sure there was appropriate ventilation in our schools. And so we, over the summer of 2020, we did two things. We invited the Harvard School of Public Health to come and work with us on our buses, and also to come and study our classrooms. And this is something that they did as a research project. And actually their study about the bus transportation has kind of been spread around the nation. And they found, first of all, that bus transportation with windows open is safe, because that was a big concern back in 2020. Is it safe for children to get on a bus to drive to school? And the answer is yes. Keeping the windows open, for example, and spacing them to some degree. That study was conducted in Needham by Harvard, and it's been widely shared. The other thing that Harvard came in and did is to study the ventilation rates in our schools. All of our schools are different. Mitchell is very different than Sunita, which is very different from the high school or Broadmeadow. Some of the schools have aging rooftop units, Broadmeadow and Elliott, and there is a capital request that I hope can be supported for Broadmeadow and Elliott. That's coming up to your attention and eventually to town meeting. And what our researchers told us is that, and what the science said, is that if you could maintain a 4 to 6 air exchange per hour in a classroom, that you would mitigate the respiratory droplets that are spread by a classroom with 10 to 20 individuals in it. And so that's what we endeavored to do. Now, the reality is that not all systems and classrooms are the same. Little children are different than high school students. And so there are a lot of variances, there are a lot of needs, and no one approach would work. But we decided to make sure we had a standard. And working with the town, and Barry was a great partner, we used COVID dollars to test each classroom. We used available dollars. Barry, there's no question the town, I don't have all the figures, but the town invested significant dollars in keeping ventilation systems in the schools, and I believe on the town side, operating at a high level. And that required, for example, more energy. And so there was an economic impact, but I can't really share that with you, Dick. I don't have all the details around that. The 4 to 6 air exchanges per hour has demonstrated that it can help keep schools healthy and to keep fresh air. It wasn't just the ventilation systems that we cranked up, but we also brought in HEPA filters, high efficiency particulate air filters that we purchased through COVID dollars. We deployed them in classrooms that did not meet the standard. In some cases, we just opened the window and the classroom door. Mitchell's a good example of that. Pollard is a good example. We had to literally just open windows, install screens, and keep the doors open so that there could be a sufficient air exchange in Mitchell classrooms. In some other cases at Mitchell, we had to crank up the fan in the classroom unit. That has continued through this year as well. Now, what's different from this year to last year is that we are not monitoring it as regularly as we were. We were monitoring it every other month and checking every single classroom. Barry does not have the resources to do that. He's short-staffed, and I felt that we had something in place, it should generally work. We are testing classrooms. We just tested Pollard in the high school over the December break, and I'm awaiting the engineer's report to see if there are any problems with ventilation that we might need to address, for example, by changing an air damper or increasing a motor speed, or perhaps installing a HEPA filter. I just don't have that information right now. We did sample classrooms in the fall, and we found that all of our classrooms were performing at the rate that we expected. The national rate, which is approximately 2.8 air exchanges per hour, and that's the national standard, will presumably require less energy to run, if you will, but we're not there right now. I intend to continue to work with the town to run the systems as best we can for the rest of the year, and then we'll have to reevaluate over the summer if we can, if you will, tune it down a bit in regards to ventilation. Ventilation is complicated by heating and air conditioning. I was sharing with, I think, our liaisons recently that, frankly, the most complicated building to work with is Sunita. And it's also our newest building. But it is so sophisticated that it requires really tender care and a lot of attention to make sure the systems all work in sync and work together. Fortunately, Barry is committed to that. That's kind of his wheelhouse, if you will. However, he is short-staffed. He can't bring people on board because people won't take the pay. They're looking for more, and we need more sophisticated maintenance to make sure these systems are working. So yes, it is costing more. I recognize that. I don't have all those figures. We expect to maintain the standard through the end of the school year, and then we'll certainly reevaluate what do we need to do next year based on where we are with the pandemic.
That was helpful. I wasn't arguing with where we ended up. I was just wanted to understand better the process we went through to get to where we ended up, and what
I think Dick, the other thing that what I didn't say is in the summer of 2020, if you go back to the summer of 2020, which is like a nightmare to me, and I still have flashbacks, so much was happening in that summer because people were wondering, could we even open schools? Would we even open schools? And we were committed. I know the town manager was committed, the school committee was committed, I was committed. We were going to open schools. But one of the things we knew was going to be important was to have appropriate ventilation in our schools. And so there really wasn't, there was time to do some research, but there wasn't necessarily time to pull everyone together and to say this is what should happen. We used the research. We said, okay, boots on the ground, let's get this done. And very quickly, all of this came together.
And that made sense at the time.
I guess I just add about the ventilation and maintenance. It would be one thing if it was just more dollars and having to hire more people. That would be one conversation. I feel like we're starting to have a second conversation also. How do we actually find these people to hire? There's so many staff shortages. And that's in some ways an even more difficult conversation to have.
Yeah, I agree.
Other questions? I have one. So for this year, you mentioned the $1 million holdback from supplies. And I noticed last night that I think the Select Board, appropriated or approved a reallocation of ARPA funds for COVID tests for the school system. And my understanding is that those $230,000 would have otherwise been spent from those holdbacks. So I'm just curious how you intend to spend the remaining held back funds this year.
Well, through a combination of Ann being, really thoughtful and helping, guide the school committee and guide me, we had last spring set up a kind of a budget to say, okay, we're going to hold back money. We're going to use some of that money for testing. We're going to use, and when I say hold back money, we're going to hold back on some positions. We're going to hold back on curriculum materials, professional development, and supplies. And that was about, I think, Ann, about $1 million altogether. Is that right? And so we did. And what I expect is, and what principals have been asking for, is if some of those funds can be released between now and the end of the year, so they can purchase much needed supplies, so they can do some additional professional development, so we can deliver some services. So I envision a couple of things. One is that we'll be able to potentially free up some of that money so that we can get the supplies that teachers and principals are looking for. And then the other thing, at the end of the year, at the end of the day, when we've, expended our budget and everything has been reconciled, I'm sure that there will be an amount that will be turned back to the town as there was last year. So that's right now, and we don't have that work right now, that math right now. That will come later this spring, but we'll certainly, as we always do, we'll share that with the Finance Committee about where we stand with our projections for the fiscal year.
Thank you. Aaron, go ahead.
Thanks, Josh. I just wanted to point out two resources for things that came up during the meeting. For Carol's question about special ed percentages at other towns, in the Student Support Services budget presentation on December 21st, which is on our website on page 9, there is a chart comparing us to 10 other towns. We're pretty much right in the middle. I think we're 6th out of 11. The other thing is this two-pager that I think Anne produced after the first finance liaisons meeting that goes over sort of all of the one-time funding sources and expenditures in the budget. And then on the back, which ones are being asked to continue into the, to be covered for next year and which ones aren't. The vast majority are not, like 4 million I think are not, but those two might answer some of the questions that came up tonight.
Thank you, Aaron. And that it just reminds me of something. I think I've asked this in years past, but maybe not in this budget cycle. When we see those comparisons, looking at Needham versus other towns, that's one way to compare our success, how we're doing. What other metrics do we typically use to compare the success of whatever we're measuring?
Well, there are different ways to. Often when we come to budget discussions, folks ask, as came up earlier, well, what's happening in other towns? How do we compare to other towns with their staffing models or whatever? I'm very proud that we every year, when we sit down with budget managers.
I think we may have lost the superintendent. You're
what
back.
Did I do? I didn't do anything.
You're back.
We spend a lot of time with our department directors and budget managers saying, okay, you have this need, but how do we stand in the neighborhood? A similar community. Are we providing resources at a similar level, or are we do we have more or less? When it comes to classroom teachers, we certainly have less than our comparable communities. We do try to provide special education support, counseling support, nursing support at a level that meets state and national standards. And we also, of course, we look holistically at our student achievement and, everything that kinds of guides how we're doing. Every other year, we conduct a family survey to assess where families are at, what their needs are, how they're feeling about student performance. We certainly every year, we provide a report to the community, the school committee, regarding the performance of our high school students, not just in academics, advanced placement, for example, SATs, but also in music and athletic performance. And so I think we use all of that data and feedback that we receive. Plus, we've been spending a lot of time looking at our students who have struggled the most, our high need students. These might be special education students, ELL students, some students of color, to see where we really need to drive down to and dig into to bring them and boost their learning. So I think we have sometimes too much data, but we absolutely, and the school committee is always asking for more of that data to assess, are we doing the right thing, not only compared to the neighborhood, but also what do we need in our classrooms. That happened most recently at our last school committee meeting, where Terry Duggan and two of her team, Lisa and Kathleen, shared how we're targeting resources at Elliott and Newman because of specific testing scores in reading and in math at those schools. That's the kind of targeted data that we're using to make sure that we're targeting available resources to where it's needed and not just asking for all of it.
Thank you, that's helpful. Do other members of the Finance Committee have questions they want to ask? Okay, I have one last one. So I didn't notice this in the presentation, but I noticed in the other materials that you sent over that there was a request for an additional temporary office aide at Hillside while the Emery Grover building undergoes renovation. Just wondering if you could explain that position.
Yeah, what we're thinking about is that as we go over to Hillside, and the way Hillside will be configured is, and it's essentially going to be configured the way it's going to be the way it is right now. If you have been in there, I'm not sure if you have, we're moving into what they have. They have to do some infrastructure work around, we think it has to be sprinklered or part of the building. They have to do some electrical work, but we're just really moving into what exists there. And one of the needs that I see, both in the short term and potentially in the long term, but I'm not sure. In the short term is to have someone who can help organize files from the EG building, get them transitioned into Hillside, and to be a presence at Hillside in what is what I'll call the main office area at the police station right now. It's essentially right behind the bulletproof glass, because as we are set up, we're moving offices all into the classrooms, and there will be no presence there. And so we're going to need someone to greet people, to help facilitate visitors and staff who are coming in. So I see that as a need for the project, especially as we think in the latter part of next year, getting ready to organize, pack up, and relocate to Hillside, and then back again to a renovated EG.
Thank you. Okay, I think that's it. Looks like that's all the questions. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the answers. We'll, like usual, we'll be discussing this department budget along with others in the coming, excuse me, just the other budgets in the coming weeks. So in particular, I'm thinking about Health and Human Services. I know there's a lot of overlap there needs, I should say, in Health and Human Services and in schools that are similar. So we'll be discussing that at a later date, and then in March we'll be discussing the whole budget in its entirety. So thank you, everyone.
I'm happy, and I know the school committee and Ann and Terry, Mary and Alex, who've been kind of quiet, but they're the ones really who helped pull this together. I'm just I just remind them I'm the eye candy, you know. But they're the ones who do the, Louise, don't laugh so hard there, Louise Misc. They're the ones who do the work. I will also lastly say, anytime you want my perspective or voice to help out with anything regarding DPW or Needham Youth Services, but particularly DPW and maintenance, I'm happy to participate in that conversation. I think we're in a major inflection point and change here with not only the nature of the kind of people we need to maintain our building, but the resources and the structures they need to make them happen. I think this is a time that's a big time of change, and I'm happy to participate in those conversations. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for yours.
Thank you.
Marion.
Okay, folks, I'm going to move you back to the attendees. Don't jump around. I don't want to cause someone to leave unintentionally.
Perfect. Thank you, Dave. So the last item on the agenda, issues not anticipated. I don't have anything. Are there any committee updates from members of the board? Okay. I'm going to maybe, I wish I could say this is the last meeting that will be remote, but I anticipate that for a few more, we'll probably have to be remote as well. If anything changes, I'll let everyone know. Go ahead, Dick.
Yeah, just the elephant in the room of the whole school department budget obviously is Emery Grover. Where do we stand on that process?
Oh, so my understanding, actually, Dave, if you want to bring Dan in again to give any additional clarity, but my understanding is that the schools have already begun rolling out their plan and discussing it with various school communities. And I think on January 18th is going to be a meeting with Doran Whittier, the consultants, at the school department's, excuse me, the school committee's regular meeting.
I don't think that was Dick's question. I think it was with respect to the planning and design of Emery Grover and the relocation space at Hillside. Where does that currently stand since town meeting action in October? I think that was your question, wasn't it, Dick?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Sorry, I misunderstood. I don't have any updates on that, actually.
I know from reading the PBPC minutes that there's a big, there's this issue and it's not going to be an inexpensive issue that's come up, is the need for sprinklers, which they don't have currently, and they haven't had to have for fire and police. They don't put a dollar amount on it, but it just came up as something that they don't think they'll be able to avoid in all likelihood. So that may be a surprise. Sounded like it could be a surprise addition, which I don't know if that warrants an additional article that's going to happen to raise the budget or not. But anyway, that's the one thing that, based on the minutes I saw, that might be an issue.
Barry, in the minutes that you read, did it reference why when police and fire were there, this issue didn't arise?
It probably did, and I don't recall, to be honest.
Okay.
Could be how they're using the building, where they're using much more of the building. They would be using much more of the building than fire and police have used. I don't know the exact answer though.
Mr. Chair, Michael Grace has his hand up. Do you want me to bring him in?
Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you. Hi, Michael. Welcome back.
Thank you. To answer the questions in reverse order as best I can, because I am the representative for the EG on the PPPC. The building commissioner has not been happy with the continued temporary uses of Hillside. And that is one reason that, he's kind of being insistent on that. The other is that currently, as it stands now, there's a 24-hour presence there, and it's the public safety folks. So they were more willing to deal with things like life safety through the sprinklering, but they're no longer willing to do that. And they say if it's going to continue to be occupied, it has to be sprinklered. Hank, I think he had a rough estimate of what it might cost. I'm thinking 400,000 was mentioned, but don't hold me to that. But there was not a discussion that, that's going to cause everything to go over. But clearly it's something that, no one wants to do. I think anyone's happy about it, but it was made very clear by, I think the fire chief, building commissioner, others, that they're not in any mood to consider anything else. This they consider a requirement.
So Michael, is there a sense of timing as to when, what's going to be asked for at town meeting in May for the Emery Grover construction and the the Hillside relocation? What the timeline is to when we're going to be getting those numbers?
They're moving as quickly as they can to get those. I mean, they're going to, I don't know what the exact timeline is, but yes, the goal is to have all this work done well in time so that, it can be reviewed by the PPC and you all can see it. I don't have the exact dates in front of me, but it's a very compressed timeline. So Hank and his team working, with the architects and the planners are working very hard to get that because they understand we all need that. I mean, I'll find out when we have our next meeting. I don't know when the exact date is, but we understand that this is something that clearly you want to see, as do we, before we come to town meeting with the construction request.
We have an upcoming budget consultation with building design and construction. Maybe we can ask those questions then as well.
Yeah, I'm sure Hank will have, a little more information basically every week. He has more information.
Thank you, Michael.
Okay, you're welcome.
Any other questions, updates? Okay. Thank you, everyone. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Don't move. Second.
We'll take a roll call. Rick?
Yes.
Dick?
Yes.
Barry?
Yes.
John?
Yes.
Carol?
Yes.
Louise?
Yes.
And the chair votes yes. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Right.